Thank you. A real gift to be here with you. The times that, and I've been trying to attend these meetings as regularly and as often as possible. Some of you know that I spent 17 years as a pastor of a local church and 17 years now in the academic world. But I remember my years as a pastor. I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, church planting and doing campus ministry. What I remember about that was actually gatherings like this that provided such incredible emotional and spiritual support. I was part of 3 different groups. I was part of the Asian American Pastors Gathering in Boston. I was part of the Cambridge Association, Pastors Association, and I was part of the 10-Point Coalition, which was doing some at-risk work, at-risk youth, intervention with at-risk youth in the city of Boston. And each of those provided that very necessary space that I think CCC is also providing, a place where pastors can gather. So I want to begin by saying that I want to honor the work that is in this room, because you all are doing that frontline work. So I have the highest respect, having served for 17 years as a pastor, for the pastors in this room and the work that you are doing. I'm also very much aware that this is a particular time period where the stress on pastoral ministry is extraordinarily high. Some of you know the numbers are pretty frightening. So many of you persevered through COVID and the work that you did as pastors, pastoring your community through COVID. At the same time, through those 2-3+ years, there's now, at the end of that process, there's a very high rate of burnout. The number of resignations in churches are extraordinarily high. So what I don't want to do, which is oftentimes what I end up doing because of my maybe kind of the type of teaching that I do, I don't want to add to your burden, which already feels heavy. But I also feel the pastoral word is a little bit more of a challenge than it is a balm. So I just want to make sure that I want to make sure that it's okay with you, that I completely understand the suffering, the pain, the struggles that many of you are going through, but I also want to push you a little bit on what it might mean to be a pastor in this era, in this time period, but also in light of AAPI, the AAPI History Month. So I do get a chance to speak to pastors quite a bit, conferences, denominational gatherings, and church planting gatherings. It's kind of an area that I've worked at. So one of the questions that I almost always ask to a pastor's gathering is, if you would either close your eyes or think about this, think of a particular place in your community that is suffering the most and that is experiencing the most pain. So ask that central question. Where is the place of pain that you recognize right away in your neighborhood, in your city, and you can identify immediately? You can see their faces. You can put yourselves next to them. You know the reason for that pain. You know why they came to that place of pain. And so think of that place in your community, in the city of Pasadena, in the neighborhood that you live, and you can say, this person is in pain. This community is in pain. The backup question to that is, if you are unable to think about a person in pain in your community, then why are you in that community? You don't know the community well enough to think of someone that is in pain in your community. You don't love your community well enough to find the most pained person in that community. Why are you there? If you can't stay in that place of lament with the community in pain, maybe that's not the community you've been called to. I raised this with church planters, having been a church planter myself for many years. I was part of 4 different church plants. And that's usually the way you separate, I would say, separate the wheat from the chaff. From the pastors who are there to make a name for themselves versus the pastors who are genuinely, authentically wanting to see change in their community. And it often comes down to, do you know and are you aware of where the place of pain is in your community, and can you stay in that place? Now, I raise this again in light of AAPI month, because the power of seeing and the power of being seen in that place of pain is an important part of the AAPI narrative over the last several decades. That so many of the Asian American Pacific Islander stories have been hidden and have not been spoken of, especially the pain. There's a Japanese proverb that goes, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. That's a kind of an inside story for us. We don't want to stick out. We don't want to feel different. We want to be part of the community, and we don't want negative attention in some ways. The way I think about it is we're very much like our food in some sense, in that the staple of our food, whether it's tofu or rice, are great carriers of other flavors, but maybe we don't really have a flavor of our own. That was a joke, by the way. But that idea of we want to blend in as an Asian community. We don't want to stick out. I'll share this example. I was a professor in Chicago for many years. And some of you know the story that Chicago went from about 200 Asian Americans in 1940 to about 20,000 Asian Americans in 1945. Why? They were actually those folks from here in Southern California who were shipped off to Santa Anita at the race grounds, where they were then from there shipped off to internment camps all over the United States. They lost their homes, they lost their property, they lost their identity, families were split apart. It was a brutal, brutal moment. And if you've ever seen pictures of the Japanese internment and those who are being kind of forced into boxcars, it looks exactly like the Holocaust. It looks exactly like the images are almost exactly the same. So what happened was those who were sent away to these camps decided there's nothing for us to go back to in Southern California or Northern California. Our businesses are taken away. Our neighbors took some of our property away. There's no home to go back to. So many of them decided to move a little further away, and they actually ended up in Chicago. Hence the growth from 200 Japanese Americans to 20,000. And they started these Christian communities on the north side of Chicago. So even to this day, there's a Methodist church and a Congregational church that have generational roots in the Japanese community. I had the great privilege of going to speak to one of those churches. And I'm a Korean American, but I wanted to kind of reflect back on this incredible moment of pain in U.S. history, the internment and the incarceration of Japanese American citizens unjustly. And as I began to share the story, after I shared the story at church, I had about maybe half a dozen 20 or 30-year-olds rush up to me and said, you finally explained my grandmother to me. And there were elderly women in their 90s who had actually survived the internment, who were teenagers when they were taken away from their homes in Southern California. And yet it was the 20-year-olds, the 30-year-olds who rush up and say, I finally understand my family. Because we don't talk about this. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. We don't talk about the story of internment because that's not our culture. And I did notice that those who actually were survivors didn't come and talk to me. But it was the grandchildren who were still feeling the generational effects of a trauma that had occurred decades and decades earlier. The pain was still there. It just was under the surface. It just wasn't being addressed. My own struggle is as an Asian American, wanting to be seen and oftentimes not seen. I've been at churches where I'm visiting and the ushers ask me if I'm lost. I'm a professor of evangelism at a seminary. I'm the last person that's lost at a church, right? That's my whole job, to be at a church. And I'm asked, are you lost? Which is a way of saying, are you sure you're at the right place? Is this where you're supposed to be? I've been told by students in the first day of class, I'm not going to learn anything from you. And where did they come to that conclusion? Not based upon even looking at the syllabus, but by looking at the professor and says, oh, you have nothing to teach me. I've been told by students, you got this job because you're Asian American. Never mind my multiple degrees in theology, my 2 masters and my 2 doctorates and my 6 books. It doesn't matter, you got this job because you're an Asian. That's what it means to want to be seen, but oftentimes not really seen. To be told, you don't really get the culture of our school, so you don't really fit here. To be asked in a faculty meeting, when I raised the issue of equity and diversity, what more do you want? To constantly having to play a certain role in order to fit in. And by the way, I can't get angry, because if I'm an angry Asian man, that's a threat to the safety of the room, right? Because I might go kung fu on y'all, and that's the end of that. The metric that I've often used, and this is very much used in the African American community, is that the minority male, the person of color, the male, is either a pet or a threat. I'm a pet if I play by the rules, and if I stay within the lines, and if I keep my anger under the surface, and all that frustration that I'm feeling, just keep it inside. Just don't let it stick out. Then I'm the pet that fits in, so I can tell the jokes, and I can keep the people amused and entertained. But the second my anger is shown, then I become a threat. I am no longer comic relief. I'm the kung fu master that might hurt people. In the Asian women's category of Asian women, Bell Hooks writes about the black woman is viewed as a mammy or a Jezebel. Very similar metric, but the idea of the black woman that takes care of you is the housekeeper, is the cook, versus the black woman who is the sexual predator. And in the Asian community, it's very much the same way. It's the Asian woman who is the cook, the laundry woman, or the Asian dragon lady, the prostitute. And that the Asian female is either servile and subservient or an excessive object of sexual desire, which is very much threatening to white normativity. And so there are times that we feel invisible or seen and misunderstood. And those are the times we need people to sit with us in our pain, to acknowledge that our pain is real and for us to be seen. And I raise this in a very specific way because there are two things that have kind of struck home for me this past week. One is that Mother's Day is coming up this Sunday. And it's a painful time for me personally because I lost my mom 2 years ago. And the feeling of what it was like to lose someone that has been your spiritual hero all of your life. But the other thing is that we just passed in spring of 2021 the second year commemoration of the Atlanta shooting. And you may remember, this was at the height of COVID, but it was also at the height of AAPI hate awareness. My dear friend Russell Jung and many others were raising the statistics that showed the stunning number of Asian American hate crimes directed towards Asian Americans that have occurred, particularly when COVID started, when there was all that negative language from politicians about COVID. And the spike in Asian American AAPI hate. And I would say that it culminated, or we felt it the most as an Asian community, in the shootings in Atlanta. The part that really hurt me more than the shooting itself in some ways is the way there were Christian friends of mine who were refuting that this was a racially motivated crime. They would say, oh, they were sex workers. They weren't, they weren't targeting Asians. It was just a crazy guy who just decided to shoot up a Korean neighborhood. Or it was just, some random person who, had a sexual addiction, and that's why that person was getting violent. And so there was this kind of push away, again, not being seen. The Asian woman as a sexual object rather than a person of worth and merit. And so when those names came up and the ages of the women came up, senior citizens, many of them in their 70s and their 60s, with very specific Korean names, that's when I had lost it. My mom had died that year. She had died in August. This event occurred in the spring, so it had been less than a year. My mom's story was very much like those senior citizens who were working in that place in Atlanta. She was the one, she worked, some of you know that we lived in an inner city neighborhood in Baltimore, and she worked in one of those inner city carryouts. You know the places, if you grew up in the hood. It has the plexiglass in the front, bulletproof, the Lazy Susan that passes the food and the money back and forth. So my mom worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and then at night she would work a night shift at a nursing home, an inner city nursing home. And because she was a single mom, because we were poor, we were on food stamps and lived in Section 8 housing, because she was an immigrant single mom, society decided they had a name for her. It was called Welfare Queen. So she was not seen, but when she was seen, she was a net negative to society. A welfare queen that cheated the government to get food stamps, to keep her kids fed. And I remember visiting her at work, and again, at that place where there would be a line of people to get food, and nobody knew her name, nobody knew her identity. She was just the random, faceless immigrant worker that served us. And I remember feeling what that must have felt like 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, to be a nameless, faceless person. But then I have another image of my mom that I carry with me more and more. And that's the image of my mom on Sundays and at church retreats. Because there would be a line of people waiting to talk to her. But it was a line of people that wanted her to pray for her. Because she was at church, she was not the faceless, nameless immigrant. She was in the Korean church we call Kwonsanim, which is a word for female elder. And so at church retreats, there would be a long line of people wanting her to pray for her. And that distinction of how society saw her as a nameless, faceless immigrant, and how the church saw her as someone of worth and value who had something to contribute to the spiritual life of that community. Those are the images that still are haunting me. And for me to say, as a pastor, as a professor, how do we become one that honors and lifts up the Esther Raz of the world, that honors and lifts up the single parents, the immigrant moms? Those are the ones that honor. When my mom passed away, I was devastated. And then when the Atlanta shootings occurred, it was almost like my mom was killed all over again when I saw those names and the ages of the people who were killed in that incident. There were 3 women who contacted me right away, like within the second it happened. First was a prominent Latina national leader, Liz Rios, who immediately contacted me and said, "Are you doing okay? This must be really painful for you, having lost your mom, and what it must feel like to see this." There was an African-American Pentecostal preacher in Chicago who immediately not just contacts me, but that night sends me DoorDash a fried chicken dinner and said, this is going to be healing for you. It was another denominational leader, an older African-American woman who the next day said, "I made a fresh batch of fried chicken. I'm going to bring it over to you." And she left it on my doorstep. It was a theme there. So I'm eating chicken, bawling, crying, because that was the comfort food my mom would make for me. That was the food she cooked at the inner city carryout. And so those moments where we remember that the most broken places in our society sometimes are the most hidden. And how can we as a church bring healing to those spaces of brokenness? Gracious God, thank you for the pastors here who are doing such good work. And I pray for their heart to continue to see the brokenness around them, to see the hidden pains, and to continue to be the salve and the balm and the healing that is so needed in our community now. We pray this in your name. Amen. Amen.